Hey friends, welcome to the second video on imposter syndrome. I'm glad that you are here. If you haven't watched the first video, I'm going to go ahead and link it below so you can watch that as well. And in today's video, we're going to learn 4 things that you probably don't know about imposter syndrome, but are very important to know for you to identify imposter syndrome in yourself and also overcome your imposter syndrome. So stay tuned for that. And what we're gonna do in this video as well is we're gonna use somebody that is really well known to kind of illustrate what imposter syndrome looks like, because it can actually be really hard to spot. And you'll kind of understand it more at the end of this video. So I'm excited to get started. Grab your tea, coffee. I have my tea here, which is aka swamp water.
You know, I always figured that tea was just going to taste like hot brown water. And you know what? I was right. Yeah, it's horrible. No, thank you.
So I recently read an amazing autobiography by none other than the Fresh Prince himself, Will Smith, and it was phenomenal and I highly recommend it. And I think it is an amazing example of what imposter syndrome looks like in real life. And you can really learn so much from Will and kind of his struggles that he went through to accept himself and to think of himself as enough, which might be crazy to hear because he's actually an incredibly successful actor and we kind of envision him as like a very happy guy. And it's shocking to see and hear how much he's struggled. And this is, I think, just the perfect illustration of imposter syndrome, because oftentimes imposter syndrome really goes undetected on the outside. And this brings me to the first thing that you really need to know about imposter syndrome is that imposter syndrome is not for lazy people who are failing and don't do well in life or they don't set big goals. Imposter syndrome is often in the most high achieving people. It occurs in people who are high achieving, who are doing the big things and who seem externally really successful. Imposter syndrome is actually usually triggered when somebody gets a promotion or they kind of really move up to a higher level. And then they start kind of questioning, like, am I really ready for this? Do I have the skills to deliver on the things that are expected from me? Are these people around me, are they going to find out that I'm a fraud and that I shouldn't be here? And it makes you feel really scared and just bad in general. So one story that Will tells in his book, in his autobiography, that I think illustrates this perfectly is that Will actually became fairly close to Nelson Mandela. And Will really respected him and just really admired him. And Nelson Mandela actually invited Will to come kind of hang out with him in South Africa. And it really makes sense when you view it through the lens of imposter syndrome. What he did was that he just put off the invitation. He just kind of ignored Nelson Mandela. Like, he was just like, oh yeah, one day, like, I'll come visit you. Even though Will really wanted to visit him and he was extremely honored to be invited, he was worried that Nelson Mandela would find out that Will himself was not as great as he initially thought. He thought that maybe by spending more time with Nelson Mandela would then realize that Will is a fraud and his initial impression of him was false. So many of us can see that this is just plain old imposter syndrome. But when you're in it, it is so hard to see. And that is my second point with imposter syndrome, is that it's incredibly hard to see in yourself. It's fairly easy to see in others because we can look at Will Smith and we can see like, oh my gosh, like, of course he should have gone. Like, he's a great actor. He's hilarious. He's the Fresh Prince. Like, who wouldn't like him? Like, he's one of the most liked actors out there. And we can see that that was obviously imposter syndrome and that his cognitions were completely distorted. But when it's ourselves, it is so hard to see. It's virtually impossible and it really takes work. So if you're in a situation like Will was, like maybe you're thinking about going for a promotion and people have told you that you should go for it, but you kind of have all these thoughts like, oh no, but I'm not good enough. Like, I know everyone said it, but like, they don't know. Like, if I actually get it, then they would see how bad I am. Then that might be imposter syndrome. It probably is imposter syndrome. And you might want to really work on that and kind of look into those thoughts. And I'll share an exercise at the end of this video to help you do that. Okay, so moving on to the third thing that you really need to know about imposter syndrome to overcome it. So there are actually 3 childhood archetypes that often result in somebody developing imposter syndrome. So the 3 are smart, hardworking, and survivor. And these are three separate types that are often developed in childhood that typically lead to imposter syndrome. So the first of all is hardworking, and that means that essentially you were rewarded or you were told that you're the hardworking one, you're the hardworking sibling, like you're just working really hard. And the reason that this can lead to imposter syndrome is because there's an assumed narrative here in which you are basically being told that you don't have the inherent kind of skill or value that maybe another person has, and that you need to work extra hard to overcome that. And even though hardworking sounds super amazing, there's actually kind of an underlying narrative that is potentially harming you. So with the second one, it's very similar. So if you were told that you were smart, like you're inherently smart, like then oftentimes what happens is that you feel super, super scared of failure, because if you fail, then that would mean that that was false, that you're not actually smart, and that there's something very wrong with you, because if you are smart, why would you fail? Right? So if you fail, then it would disprove your value to other people and to yourself. And that's really scary, right? And the third one is one that's recently come out in research, is the survivor. So it is kind of living your life based on the idea that you have to overcome things that are very difficult and other people don't, and that you have to be harder, stronger, just have more grit than anyone else, because maybe life is more unfair for you. Maybe you did have a hard time growing up and you did have to overcome a lot of challenges, but you bring that mindset into adulthood and you basically overwork and you feel like you can never stop. And if I had to identify Will as one of these, I would say that he is the survivor. If you read his autobiography, you can kind of see elements of that. And I do highly recommend that, because it is just so helpful to see this thing in another person, because oftentimes imposter syndrome can make us feel very alone. It's a very kind of isolating mindset. So if you are able to kind of see it in others, or even talk to someone that's also struggling with it, it can be just so freeing just to normalize it. And it can be super helpful just to do that. And so for the fourth thing that you don't know about imposter syndrome, but it will help you overcome your imposter syndrome, is that imposter syndrome is linked to a manic defense. And a manic defense sounds very complex, but essentially what it is that it's a cycle in which someone feels a negative emotion. And in order to avoid that negative emotion, they engage in overworking or overfunctioning. So they do things at a very efficient, rapid speed, and essentially just try to kind of outrun their emotion in a way. And so this kind of sounds like it might be a good thing, because we all really value efficiency and productivity. But often what happens is that individuals who engage in a manic defense will essentially overwork to the point that they completely burn out, and they essentially then kind of disappear from the face of the earth. Like, they're not returning calls, they disappear to their friends and family, their work productivity completely diminishes, and then they kind of go into a hole by themselves because they're so depleted that they need to recover from this manic defense. And once they're recovered, then they engage in the cycle again. So as you can imagine, this cycle often leads to a lot of shame. When an individual kind of has that burnout period and they disappear, they often feel a lot of shame about it, from not responding to texts or not being productive. And it can add to that burden of imposter syndrome and the anxiety and kind of depression burden that a lot of people have these days. And the way that it's related to imposter syndrome is that individuals with imposter syndrome are essentially living with a baseline fear that's much higher than everyone else's at all times. So they are struggling with a lot of difficult emotions, like, am I going to get found out? I'm feeling shame. I'm super scared. And they want to really avoid those emotions because they're painful. And so they engage in the overfunctioning. They try to prove themselves. They overwork. They just do as much as possible to prove to themselves that that fear and that difficult emotion is unjustified, and that they can maybe work enough to avoid a bad thing happening. And then oftentimes when the bad thing doesn't happen, they feel very justified in their manic defense cycle. And they think like, well, if I didn't have this cycle, then all the bad things would happen. And so they're very attached to this cycle. And maybe if you're listening to this right now, you might be thinking, oh, like, well, she doesn't know. Like, I actually need to do this. Like, she can't take this away from me, because if she took this away from me, like, I'd be a complete, like, couch potato. And I'm guessing that you actually wouldn't be a couch potato, but I understand how oftentimes we get really, really attached to our coping mechanisms. And I think it needs to be a slow process to kind of unattach from them. And maybe kind of the first step might be acceptance and just kind of maybe noticing your cycle as you go through it, as you kind of start having difficult emotions. Maybe something happened that made you feel a lot of fear that then leads you to just overwork like crazy, and then you crash and then you do it again. Now that you've listened to this video and kind of had the cycle explained to you, you're probably going to start noticing it a lot more. And as you notice it, you're going to start maybe thinking that maybe there's better ways to do this. Maybe there's more sustainable ways that you could engage in productivity and efficiency and just creating work in your life that doesn't necessarily have to be so corrosive to you and potentially those around you. And so in the YouTube series that Will Smith did, where he loses 20 pounds in 20 weeks, we actually have a beautiful illustration of this. Will engages in this quite a bit because he is so attached to that 20-pound weight loss goal. That he pushes himself into a complete overtraining cycle, over restriction cycle. And then eventually, as you see him over restrict and overtrain, over exercise, because he's scared that he won't meet the goal, then you see him completely crash. And then he essentially completely disappears. Like, he doesn't show up to his training sessions. Like, his videographer and his trainer can't reach him. And they both like all show up to the filming location and he's not there. And they're all kind of disappointed because they're just trying to do their jobs.
Will didn't show up this morning. You know, we're here making the best of it, shooting some B-roll stuff.
Is that what he just said?
Yeah, they just said.
And Will obviously feels very ashamed about this when he comes back and apologizes to them for letting them down. And you can tell that this was like a very painful process to him.
Is somebody who has been so rewarded by the world for putting his head down and grinding and getting the win. The first thing I think as a psychologist in his presence is, how the heck does this guy cope when he's not winning?
Okay, so now you're probably thinking like, okay, this sounds all well and good. Like, how do I not engage in these cycles? How do I overcome imposter syndrome? And one of the most effective ways to overcome imposter syndrome thoughts and narratives is actually to utilize self-compassion. And before you start thinking that that sounds really soft, like I'm gonna click off this video, like what is she talking about? Just bear with me for a second. Like, self-compassion is actually a super well-researched concept and training to help people increase their feelings of self-esteem and just be more efficient, more productive, and build up their resilience to burnout. And unfortunately, self-compassion does sound like a little bit of a soft concept, and I wish we had a better name for it. And if you're having a hard time kind of getting on board with the whole self-compassion thing, like maybe you can think of it as like self-talk or like optimized self-talk. That sounds good. Like, I think I'm gonna use that. Yeah, we'll call it optimized self-talk, right? Because everyone likes to optimize things these days, right? Okay, so think about how you talk to yourself in your head. Think about your self-talk. I'm guessing that a lot of you talk like a drill sergeant in your head. Like, why aren't you doing this? This isn't enough. Like, you're so weak. Like, why are you tired again? Like, come on, man up. Like, keep going. Like, we got to get this done, etc., etc., etc. And most of us are super attached to this voice because we think like, oh, if I don't have this voice in my head, like, I'll literally never get anything done. And that's actually disproven in research. Like, if you want, I can send you like all the psychological studies, and there's many that showcase that this is actually an ineffective technique, and it is less effective than actually using a self-compassionate self-talk. So you can argue with it, but there's a lot of studies that will prove you wrong. Okay. So now that we've established that, let's talk about this voice in your head. And I don't mean like a crazy voice in your head. I mean like your self-talk. So when you talk to yourself, I want you to really notice what you're doing there, because it's actually really important. And it's super important to your mental health, and it's super important to your work and life and just overall like satisfaction with anything. As you talk to yourself, I want you to notice, when do you make yourself feel bad? When do you hurt yourself? You might be desensitized to how much you hurt yourself. like you hurt your own feelings. But I'm guessing that you do it quite a bit, because if you haven't had some type of self-compassion training or focused on learning this, the status quo is often that you are just really, really mean to yourself. And that is completely just super exhausting. Like if you finish out your day and feel exhausted, it often is because of this, because you're going around just like slapping yourself on the face all the time mentally, and it just drains you. Like if you ever had a fight with someone, like, and you felt super exhausted the next day, and I mean like a verbal fight, like an emotional fight, not a physical fight, although that would probably exhaust you as well. But yeah, if you've ever had like just an argument or a fight, or have had something just negative, like a negative altercation happen, then you often feel like super depleted afterwards and just like you want to go to sleep, right? And so you're doing this exact same thing to yourself in your own head. You're basically like bullying yourself, and you got to stop. And stopping is a process. Like you're not just going to stop overnight. But what I found to be effective with clients is that when you do start to notice this negative self-talk, this like kind of drill sergeant, and it's often really helpful to name it. So you can name it the drill sergeant. I think Will named his negative self-talk the general in the book, which is, I think, a really good visualization as well. Everyone can kind of have a different type of visualization, but it can really help to separate that voice from yourself. That voice is not you. That's like just your coping mechanism that's really scared. So as you notice the general or the drill sergeant, etc., you want to really start seeing how it makes you feel. You want to start checking in, and you're probably desensitized, like I mentioned before, so this will be new. But as you kind of say like, oh God, like I look super fat today, geez, like think about it, like, how does that make me feel? Like, does that make me feel good? No, it doesn't. Like, calling yourself fat never makes you feel good. So as you see yourself saying those types of things and you notice that it makes you feel bad, what I want you to do is then I want you to say in your head to yourself, we don't talk to ourselves that way. And if you want to kind of do a little bit more, you can start trying to replace it with a more positive phrase that you actually believe. And please don't make the mistake that most people do in this type of exercise, in which they start like thinking like super positive thoughts, like, I don't look fat, I look like Cindy Crawford. Like, do people know who Cindy Crawford is still? I'm not sure, but she's like an old supermodel. And that's the first name that came to my head. I'm going to post a picture of her here. Okay, so as you start to kind of see your negative self-talk, the way you're hurting yourself, you want to actually think of thoughts that would actually be believable to you. Like, hey, you know, I look the way I look. Or, you know, like, hey, I really like my biceps. Like, I have great biceps. Like, you know, like just start to like focus your mind on different things. And I know that that was a really random example. But the most important thing in this exercise that I want you to learn is to say, we don't talk to ourselves that way. It's going to take practice. It's going to take repetition, but it's going to warrant great results in helping you overcome this negative self-talk. And when it comes down to it, imposter syndrome is negative self-talk. It's the repeated pattern of negative self-talk as a result of a certain kind of childhood upbringing, and as a result of a certain narrative that you've created for yourself, about yourself in your head. And let me know like how this is working for you all in the next week. I really, really want you all to use this. And I just really want you all to stop being so mean to yourselves in your own heads. If I could just have one wish, that would be my wish for you all, and essentially for the world, is for people to stop being so mean to themselves in their own heads. It would have such a positive effect on the world. And if you need any help with this, I'm here. I'll link my website, my Calendly below. Feel free to schedule a meeting. I love meeting you all. And I want you all to feel better and really enjoy the rest of this December month. I will see you all next week with another video, and take care.